It concerns Britain's most famous UFO case, an alleged alien craft that landed in a forest in Suffolk. Now, I really actually didn't do this interview. I'm going to hold my hands up. Producer Brett, who was with me on Saturday, you did it, didn't you?
I did, yeah, and I had a chat with Nick Pope, who's a very famous UFO researcher. He used to work for the Ministry of Defence for about 20 years, and he also ran the government's UFO project for a couple of years, believe it or not, in this country. Now, the Rendlesham Forest incident, if you've not heard about this before, it took place, or it's alleged to have took place, December 1980, near a couple of American Air Force bases in Sussex, and it's claimed that a UFO landed in the woods, was seen, photographed, and even touched by members of the American Air Force. Now, Nick Pope has written a book about the case. It's co-authored by the two main witnesses, and I started by asking Nick just to explain, summarise exactly what's meant to have happened.
It started with strange lights being seen in Rendlesham Forest that were initially thought to be perhaps the crash of a light aircraft and a small fire. Military personnel went out to investigate, and my two co-authors, John Burrows and Jim Penniston, found not a crashed aircraft, but a landed UFO, a small triangular craft. Some photos were taken, which they were subsequently told didn't come out, but fortunately Jim Penniston made some sketches as well in his police notebook, and that has survived. They touched the side of this thing. After being on the ground for a few minutes, it just rose vertically up over the treetops and then shot off at huge speed. It was tracked on radar. It left physical traces on the ground, including scorch marks on the sides of some of the trees, and critically, in evidential terms, radiation levels, which were assessed by the Ministry of Defence as being significantly higher than the average background. And again, all those government documents have survived. The UFO returned a couple of nights later, and on that occasion, the witnesses included the Deputy Base Commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt. So, I mean, in terms of multiple military witnesses, UFO tracked on radar, physical evidence like radioactivity, this really, cases don't get better than this.
And you talked about the evidence that was there. And the interesting thing for me, Nick, about Rendlesham, as you know, having worked for so many years with the Ministry of Defence, normally when people report UFOs or strange craft, if they are, dare I say, like me, just a guy in the street, they can be dismissed as cranks or as drunks or as liars. But when it is kind of military personnel, these people should know what they're talking about, shouldn't they? They should be used to the kind of high-pressure situations and aircraft in general.
Absolutely. They all went through various degrees of security vetting to get the jobs they did, and some of them, particularly Jim Penniston, had initial basic security vetting, but over and above that was on something called Personnel Reliability Program, people responsible for particularly sensitive subjects had this extra security clearance. So these people, both in terms of vetting and indeed their experience. I mean, you know, there's a lot of talk about, well, maybe they just saw and misidentified some secret prototype aircraft or drone. I mean, if there was anything flying, whether it was operational or experimental, these are the people that would have known about it.
And in terms of the investigation that followed, Nick, I know this is where a lot of the controversy lies, and some people's point towards a government cover-up and such forth. In the immediate aftermath, obviously, these men reported what they had seen. And what was was there an investigation? What was the official conclusion?
There were actually two investigations, one led by the United States Air Force and one led by the Ministry of Defence in the UK. Now, the Americans were in a very difficult position because in one sense they weren't really supposed to be investigating UFOs at all. The American government's public position was that the subject was no longer of any interest when their own UFO project, codenamed Bluebird, closed down at the end of 1969. So, in a sense, any American investigations ran counter to official government policy. So that had to be done very sensitively, and this is where I think some of the conspiracies started, because the most senior general American Air Force general in Europe, General Gabriel, was briefed on this and then took items relating to the investigation back to his headquarters in Germany. And the trail's gone a bit cold on that, I'm afraid.
And just going back in terms of the object that they cited in the woods, you say it was, or they reported it was triangular in shape and had, my understanding, kind of bizarre markings on the side of it as well.
That's right. There's a sketch that has survived. We've put it in Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, but I think it's fairly widely available on the internet as well. And yes, these strange symbols. I mean, normally, of course, you'd expect something like the RAF roundel to be on the side. Well, these markings were I hasten to say this is a pun intended, but like nothing on earth. I mean, they were the closest we can come up with is almost like Egyptian hieroglyphs, but it just makes no sense.
And in terms of what happened over those few nights, I mean, no one knew about this for a number of years. And am I right that it was one of the it was the News of the World, wasn't it, that kind of broke this story several years later? How did that all come about?
Well, yes, the whole incident, I think people forget how different it was back in 1980. There was no internet, no social networking sites, no Freedom of Information Act in the UK. And yes, the whole thing stayed secret until, as a result of some whistleblowing and some fairly tenacious local investigators, as you say, the News of the World got hold of the story, and to their credit, they recognized immediately that this was not just another run-of-the-mill UFO story, and they put it on the front page as their main headline. And, that went out in 1983, and the rest is history.
It's critics of the case, Nick. I've read passionate defences saying that there was no craft in the woods that night or those two nights. It was the soldiers, the military personnel were chasing lights around the forest that were coming from a nearby lighthouse. That's it. The rational explanation. What would you say to that?
Well, I think actually the Ministry of Defence was inadvertently responsible for the lighthouse theory. A local forester called Vince Thurkettle suggested that it might have had a part to play on this, and because, of course, the Ministry of Defence policy on UFOs has always been to downplay the extent of its interest and involvement in the subject, this was quite useful as a way almost of debunking the case. But, I mean, you've only got to go to the forest, as I have done many times, filming there and doing interviews and things, to see that, firstly, the lighthouse is not even visible from most of the locations where the UFO was seen. And secondly, where it is visible, it's just a tiny pinprick of light on the distant horizon. It's a crazy theory, but it's good TV and good radio theory, because of course all the witnesses get absolutely furious if someone says, "Oh, didn't you just see a lighthouse?" Because it sounds like you say, have you got any idea what you're talking about? You're just crazy that you would make that mistake.
It's nearly as good as swamp gas, isn't it?
Well, I know, yes. But the other point about the lighthouse theory, and indeed all the other skeptical theories, like it was a hoax, it was a pile of burning manure. I mean, of course, none of this explains the radiation levels. And I mean, the radiation levels, people can debate that till the cows come home, but the document is there for everyone to see from the Defence Intelligence staff, and their assessment, their contemporaneous scientific assessment, was that the radioactivity levels at the landing site were significantly higher than the average background. And I mean, it's there in black and white in the government's own assessment, which is now available at the National Archives, so it's not even in dispute.
If we, plain devil's advocate, Nick, if we say that a UFO definitely landed and was in and around Rendlesham Forest in December 1980, the logical question, therefore, would be, well, why was it there? What was so interesting about that particular or those particular Air Force bases?
Well, I think that takes us into some fairly controversial territory. There have been, of course, for many years, a number of people who have raised the question of nuclear weapons at these bases. Now, I'm still bound by the Official Secrets Act, so I can neither confirm nor deny those quotes and comment on that matter any further. But suffice to say, yes, these bases were critically important to the NATO military alliance at a time where we perhaps came closer than most people realize to a Third World War. And the full story of the whole relationship between the Soviet Union and Poland and, just how close we came to Armageddon, that story has perhaps not yet come out.
Officially, at this moment in time, Nick, does the British government have an official stance on what happened at Rendlesham those nights?
No, I guess the only statement, and of course now the British government axed its UFO project, where I used to work, altogether in 2009 as part of a wider round of defence cuts. But their last statement on the Rendlesham Forest incident is that, yes, it took place. No, we don't really know what happened. There is this glib soundbite that we used to come out with, I'm afraid, that events were judged to be of no defence significance. But frankly, and with apologies, that was just a soundbite we rolled out for Parliament, the media and the public. It didn't reflect the actual level of interest and puzzlement over the UFO phenomenon, and specifically over Rendlesham Forest. So that's a long-winded way of saying the official position is it's unexplained.
And we've touched on, obviously, your work as well, Nick. You were with the Ministry of Defence for it was over 20 years, wasn't it? Something like that. And
yes, I did 21 years. Only 3 of those years were on the UFO project. I mean, I did a number of different jobs at a number of different levels and actually ended up in the Directorate of Defence Security, which was interesting in another story altogether.
The UFO project, then, I mean, can you tell us a little bit about that, what your job was for those few years when you were on that particular project?
It was essentially to research and investigate the UFO phenomenon, and specifically any sighting reports that were made to us. And we had to judge whether there was any defence threat in any of this, and over and above that question, whether there was anything of more general scientific or technical interest. In other words, could a better understanding of the UFO phenomenon, whatever it might turn out to be useful to us in the work that we did in the MOD.
I see. And in terms of the cases that, if you pardon the expression, landed on your desk, and I appreciate Rendlesham took place years before you started that assignment, where does the Rendlesham case rank in terms of other UFO sightings that you had to investigate?
I think Rendlesham is second to none. I mean, I had some very interesting cases during my 3 years on the UFO project, but frankly, none of them really measured up to Roswell, which to this day is, I think, the best evidenced, best documented UFO case that we have, arguably anywhere in the world at any time. I did a cold case review of the Rendlesham Forest incident to see what we'd missed at the time, but again, I was not able to turn up any definitive explanation for this, whether it's conventional or exotic.
Over the last 10, 15 years or so, perhaps longer, every few years, although not recently, a batch of UFO files, if you will, have been declassified by the government, and you know how it goes, because I've heard you on the radio before. There'll be a batch that's released and there'll be coverage on the radio and on the TV on that day, and then that is it. Why were the British government declassifying these previously secret files?
Well, the short answer to that is the Freedom of Information Act, and so many journalists and members of the public were making requests for UFOs that when Britain first got the Freedom of Information Act and the department drew up league tables of what people were asking about, which is usually sort of grandfather's war record and various Iraq-related questions, it turned out the MOD was getting more requests about UFOs than any other subject. So we decided to proactively release this material, and it was quite funny, I think, that a subject which for years the MOD had told Parliament and the media was of very little interest, and then it transpired, oh, by the way, here's, and the number now stands at about 52,000 pages of documentation on all of this, some of which was at very high levels of classification, like secret UK eyes only, for example. So, yes, every few years, some of this material comes out, and I wrote some of it, and I tend to comment on this on the radio and the TV when each batch is released. And in fact, there will be a final batch sometime in 2016 at a time yet to be announced. And they said that they'd finished it in June 2013, and then there was a slight, sorry, we've forgotten some files, and they've dug up 18 more. So watch this space.
Getting back to Rendlesham, Nick, there was a famous audio tape that was recorded. You mentioned General Charles Holt a little bit earlier on. The Holt tape, as it's been known, for people who may, because that's out there, that's easily to find on the internet. People who may be interested. What exactly? Because he basically made a tape recording of the events that night. That's
right. Colonel Holt was an officer who liked to carry with him a handheld cassette recorder so that he could document his experiences and thoughts. And fortunately, he had this with him as he went out, firstly to look at the landing site where John and Jim encountered the UFO on the previous night. And you can hear him, for example, instructing his disaster preparedness officer to deploy the Geiger counter, and they're measuring the radiation. And then suddenly there's that moment where through the trees they see the UFO too. And you can absolutely hear, as these events take place, the fear, the tension, the stress in Holt's voice and in the voices of the other men who were out there with him. And the UFO at one point approaches. It's directly overhead. It fires a beam of light down at his feet. I mean, just yards in front of him. And he's looked back on that years later and said, well, was this a weapon? Was this a warning? Was it communication? He doesn't know.
This was 2 nights in December of 1980, and no one's ever said that. Nothing's been back there since. Nick, you've investigated this probably more than anyone else, and you've written this book. What do you think happened at Rendlesham Forest back then?
Well, that's the ultimate irony. I can tell you what it wasn't. It wasn't a lighthouse. It wasn't a hoax, a prank. It wasn't a secret prototype spy plane or drone or anything like that. But I can't tell you what it was. I mean, in one respect, I mean, I've perhaps slightly criticized the MOD where I used to work a little bit, but in one respect, they have it absolutely right. This event is unexplained, and I mean, unexplained means unexplained, nothing more, nothing less. I mean, there are all sorts of exotic theories out there: alien spacecraft, time travelers from the future, visitors from other dimensions. We don't know. I mean, these are nice theories to put out there, but we don't know. I mean, it is a genuine mystery, but I don't think it's one yet that we have satisfactorily explained. And I don't know whether we ever will.
And finally, Nick, John Burroughs, Jim Penniston both say, among other witnesses, they believe that this was covered up from the beginning. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I suppose in a sense I played a part in that. I mean, certainly when I worked at the Ministry of Defence, I had to follow the party line of saying that these sorts of events were of no defence significance. Yes, I mean, I don't know whether I would say it's a cover-up in terms of hiding something away in an Air Force hangar somewhere. It's more a question really just of downplaying this thing and as I say, coming out with these no defence significance sound bites when, frankly, it's clear from the Ministry of Defence's own files and documents that we thought this was extremely interesting and significant.
I've got to be honest, Nick, the line, I know you were the one who said, you give this out as a matter of course, but no defence significance. To me, if there's an unexplained craft in the skies above Britain, wherever it is, whether it's above a nuclear base or a military installation or whatever, that is of defence significance, surely.
Absolutely, I agree 100%. I mean, this is, again, that's the kind of Orwellian doublethink that we had to practice day in, day out on the UFO project. But yeah, self-evidently, our air defense region has been penetrated by something. Doesn't matter whether you think it's Russian or Martian, it is a defense issue.
And there we go, Brett Burke's talking to Nick Pope, and may we apologise to Nick for not getting that on Saturday. I know a lot of people wanted it, so we played it today. Well done, you!
Yeah, fascinating stuff, wasn't it?
That is fascinating. I need to listen to it again in the bath tonight. That.
Quick mention, because so many people did contact us about Nick. His book, Encounter in Rendlesham Forest, the inside story of the world's best documented UFO incident, is available now.
And as I understand it, we had a call from somebody, didn't we, that had seen the scorch marks in the grass, actually a listener, so hopefully we can try and get them on.
We're going to try and get her on this week. She claims